Good afternoon, Rich Gimbert, the Civil War Traveler here, and I have the honor to interview author and historian Paul Brueske.
Yes.
Paul, you're about to release your first book.
Right.
Tell us about it. Tell us about the last siege of the Mobile Campaign, Alabama, 1865.
Well, Mobile was the last siege of the war, and there's been a few books written on it, but not a lot, comparatively speaking. And I was just curious. I've always been more of a fan of local history, and I started reading up as much as I could on the Mobile campaign, and I found there wasn't a whole lot out there. It was overshadowed by what was transpiring at the same time further east. So there has been I think about 3 or 4 books written on the Mobile campaign, but you know, I read through them. There's some really good stuff, but I was curious. I wanted to know more, and so basically I just started collecting as much as I could, primary source resources on the Mobile campaign, and just kept building up a collection. And then finally, with the prodding of a friend, I decided to go ahead and write a book about it, and so that's what I did.
Good deal. So let me ask, do you have a military background or anything like that? No military background, which is often the case for historians. What was the life like in your research of the average Civil War soldier here during the Mobile campaign?
Okay, so you got to remember, this is the very end of the war, and most of the guys, with the exception of Thomas's brigade,
Mm-hmm.
who were mostly young men and young boys and older men who had some military experience, but not a lot. Most of the men that came here to defend Mobile were kind of your bitter enders. They had fought most of the major battles in the Western Theater, and and I'm sure when you went to Fort Blakely, Mr. Bryan told you about the Missouri Brigade, how every man from the drummer boy to the general had been wounded many times. Well, that was a fairly accurate description of the shape of the Confederates that came here, which in my mind makes it that much more admirable that after 4 years of terrible conflict, these guys, both Union and Confederate, were still willing to come to Mobile to, the Union's case trying to take it, in the Confederates' case, even though they're vastly outnumbered, were still willing to fight. So to answer your question, the conditions, again, the guys were in pretty bad shape, but Mobile the port of Mobile had been sealed the previous summer, 8 months earlier. So the blockade was in full effect. And that, coupled with 4 years of conflict, supplies, food stores, that sort of thing were in very low supply. If you went into most of the stores in downtown Mobile, you'd see bare shelves, and they were very limited.
They had an Eastern European feel to them, huh?
Yes, yeah, it was, but probably worse. So supplies were in short demand. But interesting enough, and I talk about this in my book, is despite the low amount of supplies, and there was actually even a bread riot earlier where the women of Mobile, some of the women of Mobile, kind of rose up and demanded, food. They were starving or weren't doing good with their food sources. But despite all those shortages during the Mobile campaign, there were several female soldier support groups within the city that would they'd meet together and they'd put together care packages with baked goods and food and hams and that sort of thing. And interesting, when Spanish Fort fell, when the Union soldiers went through the fort, and same thing at Blakely, they found a lot of the food, and they talk about eating it, how well that these guys were eating. So in one sense, Mobile was probably better off than most of the other places in the South at that particular time. A funny anecdote is one of the cavalry outfits that was patrolling the Mobile Bay area was the 12th Mississippi Confederate Cavalry. And before the siege of Mobile began, these guys had fought in Atlanta and elsewhere, And in Atlanta, they were really struggling with food and eating hardtack and just really not a real palatable diet. So they come to Mobile. Now they're fishing, and you at the time you could go out into Mobile Bay and just collect as many oysters as you could carry. And so these guys were basically eating a seafood buffet on a nightly or daily basis. Well, when the gunboats, after March 17th, as the gunboats started moving up Mobile Bay, shelling the shores to clear the way for the advancing infantry, they weren't able to go and fish and get those fresh seafood that they'd been enjoying, and so they had to go back to kind of like it was in Atlanta the previous year. So things were rough at that time of the year, or that time of the war.
Okay, so let me ask. Battle of Mobile Bay. It effectively sealed up the Port of Mobile from blockade running and drastically reduced the Confederacy's ability to import goods. Why was the land campaign to take Mobile essential to the federal war effort?
You got to remember, in hindsight, people love to come back, and I've even had people tell me that Mobile was a mere mopping up operation, and I think that's an insult to the men that fought and died on both sides here. It was more than a mopping up operation, and what you have to understand is it wasn't General Canby who decided to invade Mobile. It was General Grant, the General-in-Chief. That was his decision with the prodding of Henry Halleck. They made it a priority to take Mobile. And the reason why they still wanted Mobile after the Battle of Mobile Bay, it still had value as a logistical center. And that's something people have not really pointed out in the past, is Mobile still had value as a logistical center. It had access to two major rail lines, the Mobile and Ohio and the Mobile and Great Northern Railroad through Baldwin County that went up to Montgomery and still into parts of Georgia. So you had those rail lines. You also had two major rivers that spilled into Mobile Bay. So you had access to a rail and river transportation system. Mobile was not the ultimate objective. They're trying to end the war. In order to end the war, they have to take Selma, which had the foundries that supplied the ammunition and the materials they needed to conduct the war. So you could have bypassed Mobile, but then you would have had an army in your rear that would cut your supply lines. But not only that, if you're going to garrison, again, mind you, they didn't know the war was about to end. Okay, they didn't know that. They suspected it was coming up on the horizon, but they didn't know that. So if they're going to go and take Selma and garrison Montgomery, they need a supply line, and the river and railroad system that you have access to, the terminus in Mobile, would supply that transportation, both river and rail line. So it still had logistical value. Think about it. Hood's Tennessee campaign, his invasion into Tennessee, he used one of his chief supply lines was the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. After they evacuated Nashville and they regrouped in Verona or near Tupelo, and they came down on the Mobile and Ohio rail line to come and reinforce Mobile. So, at this point in the war, things are winding down, but you got to take Mobile, and you got to. Mobile was still important, even though some of its importance definitely diminished at the Battle of Mobile Bay in 1864.
As a soldier with a military background, we all like to hear about how soldiers may have acted in a heroic manner. What's a specific story or two that you'd like to highlight, either Federal or Confederate, of a soldier's act of valor that occurred here at the Battle of Mobile?
Well, the Mobile campaign was filled with heroic deeds on both sides, Union and Confederate, and one of the it's not a particular incident, but a series of incidences or leadership was at Spanish Fort. General Randall Lee Gibson had a garrison of less than 2,000 men at one point, and he's holding off an enormous besieging army. And he employed all kinds of tricks, but he sent out a lot of sorties, as did General Liddell at Fort Blakely, to keep the advancing Unionists off balance. So the mere fact that these guys were holding out against incredible odds in and of itself, you're talking about over 45,000 troops besieging Spanish Fort and Fort Blakely simultaneously, basically simultaneously, against about 9,000 total in the entire area. Mobile, Spanish Fort, and Fort Blakely, the garrisons combined wasn't more than 9,000. So the odds were great, yet they still fought. So I think that's a testament to the character and the dedication, the loyalty, and commitment of the soldiers here. You look at the assault of Fort Blakely from a Union standpoint. These guys, you've toured Fort Blakely. You've seen some of the obstacles were there. They had landmines. They had abattis. They had all types of extrunction, tripwire, cannons, everything, and they still assaulted it very bravely against all of that, and took the fort, as they did to a lesser extent at Spanish Fort. They assaulted the northern end of Spanish Fort through the marsh, and there were a lot of examples of men on the Confederate side fighting to the last breath, refusing to surrender, and you also had the Unionists that were attacking that braved heavy fire in order to take the position. So there's lots of examples, and I talk about that in the book.
Okay. Now, speaking of the book, when you were doing the research and gathering the source material for the book, what did you learn that surprised you that you did not expect?
Well, there's lots of things about what happened here and happened afterwards. In fact, I have a whole presentation on interesting tidbits about the Mobile campaign. But one of the things I think that stands out, and I was actually consulted quite a bit with a former senior historian with the U.S. Army War College, and one of the things he told me his first book he ever read was the first book ever written on the Mobile campaign by General C.C. Andrews of the Union Army, who was a participant in the battle, and there were 12 vessels, including the Battle of Mobile Bay with Tecumseh, that were sunk in Mobile Bay. Nowhere else in the entire Civil War, no other area had as many torpedo casualties as that were sunk as Mobile Bay. So that was pretty noteworthy. And then I think Chester Hearn, who wrote a book called The Battle of Mobile Bay and the Mobile Campaign several years ago, he pointed out that Mobile was really kind of, even though it was one of the last siege of the war, it was really one of the first real, truly modern battles where you had coordinated naval and army operations that were conducted simultaneously. You saw torpedoes, you saw landmines, subterra shells, you saw hand grenades, you saw ironclad monitors, you saw trench warfare. So it really resembled World War I versus earlier Civil War battles. And by the time they got to Mobile, I think General Canby and the other leaders of that campaign had learned from the carnage of the battles like Vicksburg and Atlanta, and they were they took a little more precaution. There were still men that were killed and died and suffered in the Mobile campaign, but the casualty rates were far less than other comparable size battles that had occurred earlier in the conflict.
Okay, now let me ask. Once again, I just want to say the name of the book is The Last Siege of the Mobile Campaign, Alabama, 1865. How do people order your book?
I'll be doing about 15 or 16 talks coming up in the immediate future. So I have a Amazon Author Central page that talks about those, and you can get it at one of those talks, any one of those talks. But if you out of the area and you won't be anywhere where I'm speaking, you can order it off Amazon, and also Casemate is the publisher. You can order it from there, and I'll furnish you with a link to that so you can share.
Do you have any upcoming projects? Any now that you're on the cusp of launching your first book, which must be very exciting for you? Have you thought about what's next? Are you going to stick with the Civil War? Or are you going to branch out into other topics of historical interest? Where do you go from here, Paul?
My real job is very, very time consuming. So that's my number one priority. Maybe in the future I'll tackle something else, but my focus is on my real job, and so I'll be doing that and focusing, doing the best job I can with my full-time job. So not in the foreseeable future. So.
Fair enough, fair enough. This is Rich Gimbert, the Civil War Traveler, and I'll see you on the trail. Thank you very much.
Thank you.